Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forums Fall Series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker in the audience when asking your questions. We'll take about 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated, but never expected. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, as I pointed out, we do have a YouTube channel, the link for which is at the top of the website. Click on the icon and it will take you to the channel. We will be recording today's talk. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at www.iidf.org. Now, this afternoon's speaker, who frankly really doesn't need an introduction, but Roger Moorhouse is a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Warsaw. He's the author of several books on World War II, including Poland 1939, winner of the Polish Foreign Ministry History Prize, Berlin at War, which was shortlisted for the Hessel-Tillman Prize, and my favorite, actually, The Devil's Alliance. He lives in the United Kingdom. This afternoon, he's going to discuss his latest book, Wolfpack, Inside Hitler's U-Boat War, which came out about a month ago, and I put the link in the chat. The book offers the definitive history of Germany's U-boat campaign that challenged British naval supremacy and brought international trade to its knees. The reviews have been top shelf. I'm just going to read a few of them. The journal notes Wolfpack chronicles the misery, failure, and deaths of U-boat crews. Life aboard a German submarine, we learned, was as miserable as we've ever imagined. Military Times writes eminent scholar Roger Moorhouse peers deeper into the historiography to deliver a full, first-hand account of the German U-boat war and the men who waged it. And James Holland, who needs no introduction to this group, writes, Roger is becoming a major authority in this field. Wolfpack is a significant contribution and rightly places the U-boat campaign at the heart of Germany's strategy during the Second World War. Compellingly written, he seamlessly blends fascinating technical detail with human experience, often profoundly moving and authoritative strategic insight. Wolfpack is a superb work of history. In my humble opinion, I would absolutely agree. And we're thrilled to have Roger today. Thank you. Roger?
Thank you, Greg. That's the best introduction I think I've ever had. So that was lovely. Thank you for that. Yeah, thanks very much to everyone for tuning in. I'm going to use that old term to describe what we're doing. Just to give you a little bit of background to the book, before I sort of start talking about, I've got sort of three themes to briefly talk about in this roughly 40 minutes that we have. What it struck me when I started looking at this as a potential subject, looking at the Battle of the Atlantic, was that there is quite a lot written about it. The sort of rather the sort of comprehensive work of someone like Clay Blair, for example, 2-volume history on Hitler's U-boat war, which is very good. It's very comprehensive. You wouldn't exactly read it for fun, but it's very, very comprehensive. And a lot of that sort of work that has been done, and there's quite a lot of it, tended, or I think generally tends to treat the German side of things almost as a sort of a sideshow. So, the perspective that's given is very much, from the perspective of the destroyers and the merchantmen, the planners in Washington or in New York or in London or Liverpool or wherever it is, and the U-boatmen themselves, if they feature at all, they're kind of a sideshow, and there's a couple of maybe a little leavening with the use of some sort of friendly English language material, maybe Peter Kramer or something like that. But it's a little bit of a sideshow. So I thought, when I started looking at this, I thought the obvious angle that's missing is the German experience, right? And I thought, there's a lot of German material on this. There's a lot of published and unpublished memoirs. There's a lot of archival material. There's all of the Kriegstagebücher, the war diaries that each vessel for each patrol was required to maintain. And all of that is pretty readily available, a lot of it actually online. And I thought, that's a gap in the narrative, is actually to try and retell that story, the Battle of the Atlantic and the wider U-boat war, but to tell it from the German perspective, and to sort of see, how it was that those German crews ended up at that spot in the Atlantic on that moment where they engaged a convoy. what was it like for them? What did they eat? What was their experience? What was their training like? And what was it like when they went back to Lorient or to La Rochelle, and went ashore for home leave and things like that? So the job that I set myself was to try and tell that story in its as complete a form as possible. Um, so within that, having introduced the book in that way, I want to sort of concentrate on three particular areas, and it's a lovely alliterative title that I have, which is the fear, the filth, and the futility. I'm going to start with the filth, because filth for U-boat crews was universal. It goes, right back to the pre-war days. It was a pretty filthy existence back then. I've had a lot of conversations, having promoted this book quite extensively in the UK. I've had a lot of questions in public sessions where someone will stand up and say, my father was in the British submarine service during World War II, and he tells me that it was just as filthy as the experience of the U-boatman. So filth is kind of a given, but I think there are some aspects here. As I answered to that particular question, there are some aspects here I think are quite particular to the U-boat experience, not least because of its intensity, I suppose, and then the knock-on effect that had on the health and the mental health of the crews. So there's a lovely quote. There's one of the great films of the U-boat war is The Enemy Below with Kurt Jürgens, who plays the German commander. And there's a lovely quote in that film where he says, he's given a cup of coffee, I think, by one of his subordinates, and he says, it tastes like oil and bilge and green mold. It tastes like a U-boat. Which is a lovely line. That's from 1957 from that film, incidentally. And we all have this sort of rather romantic vision of U-boatmen, sort of luxuriously bearded as they sort of climb up the gangplank after a patrol. And that's that image we have from sort of Das Boot and from other sort of similar films. But that image kind of hides a rather grim reality, which is that essentially U-boat crews didn't wash. They would be on patrol for, on average, maybe between 6 and 8 weeks. Your crewmen didn't have they couldn't take spare clothes with them because they didn't have the facility and the space to keep them. So they were permitted only one change of underwear for a potentially 8-week patrol. One of the things you'll notice if you go back and rewatch Das Boot, for example, the great German film of the U-boat campaign, you'll notice if you watch closely that all of the crewmen are wearing the same clothes all the way through, and that supposedly depicts one completed patrol. So they're wearing the same shirts and the same jumpers and the same clothes. So you can imagine, I'm sure, the effect that would have had on their on the stench in the thing in the U-boat, and by extension on their own health. So they're wearing the same clothes. They generally don't wash. They could wash, fresh water was available, but it was rationed. So they were given the option to wash with seawater, but most of them didn't. So they just kind of stopped washing. And that, of course, has a knock-on effect. Not only is it an integral component of what became known as the U-boat stink, which is can you hear me all right? I've got a little flashed up message there saying something is not working. Is my sound okay? I'll carry on. I'll wait for Greg to interrupt if there's some problem.
Roger,
So the U-boat stink was a very common.
I'm sorry, Roger, you sound fine.
All good? All good.
Hang on one second. Yeah, everything's fine. Your audio, your video. Somebody put a question in the Q&A about the English translation of Paul Just being available. That's the only thing I see here.
Okay, no, I just had something flash up with me, but you can hear me okay, right?
Yeah, loud and clear. And see you.
I'll carry on. So yeah, the U-boat stink. So it's a lot of these sort of memoirs talk about the U-boat stink. It's one of the sort of standard staples of the German experience. And it was this combination, if you can imagine this, essentially a body odor for all the reasons that I just described, diesel, because you got two massive diesel engines in a U-boat, of course, right? They're over 300 liters each. I don't know what that is in cubic inches. I can't give you that, I'm afraid, but they're vast engines, absolutely vast engines. and diesel, of course, gets everywhere. It gets into the bilge water. It's, the stink of them is everywhere. If you've ever spilt diesel on your clothes when you're filling up the car, then you'll know what horrible stuff it is. On a U-boat, of course, everything is wet all of the time, and there are no drying facilities in a U-boat. So you basically, depending on the conditions outside, you've got a pretty reasonable chance that it would have been mold everywhere. There's a couple of patrols where they talked about watching the mold literally grow up the inside surfaces of the submarine as they progressed along on their patrol. And then, of course, you've got halitosis. You've got bad breath. One particular remains of a crew that was captured by the British in 1941. So relatively early in the war, they captured 30 men of a crew of 50. And they were examined by the Royal Army Medical Corps back in Britain. And the report, which I found in the archive on that examination, showed that half of those men that survived were already suffering from the advanced stages of scurvy. Now we'll talk about the food supply in a minute, but the advanced stages of scurvy means that their teeth are falling out. And the phrase that was used in this report was, it talked about oral sepsis, which is open sores in the mouth, right? So on top of all of those other aspects of the stink, you have halitosis as well. So all the knock-on effects, as well as this being rather unpleasant and rather smelly as an environment to be in, the knock-on effects in terms of health are noticeable. So a different medical report that I noticed, actually from a German doctor who did a ride along on a U-boat in 1943, talked about the ubiquity of skin diseases in the crew. So they had ear infections, eye infections, boils, all of their groins were infected, their armpits were infected, athlete's foot. Scabies was rife because they're all hot bunking all the time. So you can imagine that, how grim it is. There was another thing that was quite peculiar to the U-boat arm, which was known as red dog. And I haven't actually managed to ascertain precisely what red dog was, except that it was a red rash that basically sort of took over your torso and spread very, very quickly up to the chest and the neck and up to and across your torso. And I'm not entirely sure that even the crews themselves knew what it was and what had caused it, but it was obviously a side effect of this, the generally poor hygienic conditions that they lived in. Just to come to the food quickly. So food, the German High Command realized really very swiftly, needed no lessons in terms of, making that link between having good food supply and maintaining morale. So U-boat crews were initially very, very well supplied with food, and they had these sort of 40-day menus that they would, that one of which was captured in the British archives, which, have, for example, pig's trotters and spaghetti bolognese and roast beef and camembert and all of this, all sounds wonderful. And for a lot of them, I suppose, for a lot of their, certainly the opening phase of their tour, it would have been quite passable nourishment. In that opening 2 weeks, of course, they've got all the fresh food. When they leave port, everything is absolutely festooned with hams and cheese and loaves of bread. Obviously, they've got to feed 50 people 3 meals a day. So every spare space in that U-boat, and there's not much spare space, would have been festooned with food. After the 2 weeks, when all the fresh stuff ran out, you're left basically with tinned everything. And that's where the roast beef and the pig's trotters and the bolognese and all the rest of it comes in. They also had tinned bread, and I haven't really worked out precisely how you can do tinned bread, but evidently they did. It must have been pretty disgusting. But the result of all of that tinned food, of course, as I mentioned before, is a contributor to scurvy, because you had this lack of vitamin C. Now, they did take oranges and limes and so on board as far as they could get their hands on them, but obviously not enough, because, as I said in that previous medical report from 1941, early in the war, and the German crews already had advanced stages of scurvy. So the conditions that they live in are pretty grim. The food rots. Essentially, the men themselves, without wanting to put too fine a point on it, are rotting. They're in the constant damp. They're wearing the same clothes. They're not washing. Their hygiene is a disaster. And essentially the men themselves are rotting. So that's when you get that, as I said, the U-boats stink and really quite, bad physical conditions for the men, which has a knock on, as we'll see in a moment, in terms of their mental health as well. So while the filth was a universal aspect of the U-boatman's existence, the next F that I was going to talk about, which is fear, was a bit more contingent on circumstances. So in that early phase of the war, what the Germans called the happy time. It's a rather sort of incongruous term, but there we are. It's the one that they tended to use. In that period, which runs up until probably, I suppose, late 41, something like that, by the time the war begins to turn against them. But in that period, they were, relatively safe, relatively speaking, from Allied countermeasures. Allied countermeasures are rather underdeveloped. They haven't really got to grips with the U-boat threat terribly effectively by that point. This is when you have the emergence of many of these aces amongst the U-boat crews, people like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, Joachim Schepke, and so on. Statistically speaking, up until that period of, maybe late 41 into 42, statistically speaking, the lifespan of U-boat crews could be measured in, between 7 and 9 patrols. So they're relatively safe. They're not, not entirely, and of course there are sinkings and so on, but generally they're scoring much better against the convoys than are being scored against them. And it's partly because they are, the crews are very experienced. The commanders very often are very experienced. Someone like Günther Prien had pre-war experience going way back into the late 1920s, incidentally. So he had, good 10 years experience of the life of a seaman, of seaman's art, by the time war actually broke out in 1939. So very experienced crews. And also the countermeasures that the Allies would later develop are not yet fully developed. So the fear is not really there in that period. Later on, it kicks in. So from about 1943, that's always given as the sort of turning point. You could take that back into 1942 as well. Allied countermeasures really get up to speed very, very swiftly. So you've got the consistent use of Enigma intelligence, for example, for one thing, which, is used initially defensively, but then later also offensively. So not only to be able to route convoys away from where they know the Wolfpacks are, but then also later on to actually be able to target individual submarines, U-boats, and what they called hunt them to exhaustion. So literally just to sit on top of them and make sure that they couldn't escape. Ultimately, the air would give out, the batteries would give out, they'd be forced to surface, at which point they'd be destroyed. So hunting to exhaustion. And a lot of that is enabled by the use of Enigma intelligence. And then, of course, you've got the advent of airborne radar, which I think is the great unsung game changer, actually, of the Battle of the Atlantic. An aircraft equipped with radar. We all have this image, of course, of the way U-boats are sunk, from Das Boot and from, even the recent film Greyhound with Tom Hanks, for example. The stereotypical image is depth charging, is sort of rolling barrel bombs off the back of a destroyer, and in a sense, they're set to a particular depth with a barometric fuse. It goes off at 100 meters or whatever it is, and if it's in the proximity of the U-boat, within about 20 meters of a U-boat, it would cause significant damage. So that's essentially how it worked, but it's a fairly blunt weapon. By 43, the Allies have much more effective weapons. Airborne radar, for one thing. You can see a surface U-boat from essentially about 15 to 20 miles out, and start your attack run. And then by the time you actually, get to close in on the vessel, the U-boat crew would have about a minute by the time they see you in your aircraft to try and dive, and it took them 30 seconds to dive. So you can see that the margins are extremely narrow with aerial attack, and it's airborne radar that enabled them to do that most effectively. And then also the other game changer in terms of the Allied countermeasures is the advent of Hedgehog. It's a rather peculiar name, but Hedgehog was an alternative to depth charging, which was a forward-firing, multi-pronged, if you like, contact mortar. So rather than just exploding in proximity like a depth charge does, the hedgehog shell or mortar shell would actually explode on contact with anything that it hit. So of course you can see the difference between a proximity explosion with a depth charge, which might cause damage and might force you to the surface, whereas a hit with a hedgehog would literally blow a hole in your pressure hull. And if you're at the depth of 50 meters, 100 meters, you literally can't surface at that point. You're done. You're going straight down. So it's a much more effective killing weapon. And the hedgehogs come into service really 1943 onwards. So Allied measures, countermeasures really ramp up through 1942 and into 43 and really change the game. Also, of course, the Allies are able to replace the vessels that they lose through the Liberty ships program, constructed American shipyards. Actually, effectively, statistically replaced pretty much everything that the Germans have managed to sink in the Battle of the Atlantic. So statistically, that made up for the shortfall. On top of that, of course, you've got the inexperience of crews. So the German crews themselves, you've got through that first wave, those really experienced commanders, those really experienced crews, they're all dead by that point, most of them anyway. And you're down to the second and third generation who are much less experienced. Their training regimen has obviously been shortened and sort of streamlined by that point anyway, because they have to get, they've expanded the U-boat fleet quite enormously by 1942, 43. So they need to get the crews into those vessels and get them out at sea. And that means cutting down on the time that you have for all of that training. So they're inexperienced, lacking proper training, and they're actually facing an enemy which is really finally getting up to speed properly with its countermeasures. So the result of all of that stuff from, let's say, 43 onwards really is a huge increase in mortality amongst U-boat crews, for one thing. So that's a statistical lifespan that I talked about earlier on. By the middle of 1943, it used to be between 7 and 9 patrols. It's already down to about between 2 and 3 patrols, and falling. Right, so that's statistical lifespan, and the crews know it. They know they're up against a very determined enemy, and much harsher conditions than were necessarily there for their fellows at the beginning of the war. So you see a huge increase in all aspects of PTSD, combat stress, and this is something that a lot of everyone is suffering from it, but there's only there's a few people that are actually trying to study it. There's a couple of Navy doctors in the Biscay bases that start looking into this, and I've seen their files in the archive. And they know that the higher ups are not interested because the idea of combat stress kind of cuts against the sort of Nazi image of the male warrior through history, the sort of uber macho kind of image that they like to project to themselves. So it cuts against that. So they weren't particularly interested in it, and the men themselves feel that stigma of it as well. So they don't tend to talk about their sense of shortcomings as men, if you like, or as warriors, by the fact that they have perhaps wet themselves during a depth charge attack. I mean, some of them are struck mute, for example. There's a case of a radio operator who's struck mute during a depth charge attack. So they didn't necessarily want to admit to these things to the doctors, but what those doctors did was they started studying the phenomenon amongst U-boat crews. And as you can imagine, in that sort of claustrophobic environment of a U-boat, I think those stresses that they lived under are accentuated. I mean, to some extent, combat stress is common to all branches of the military in all throughout the ages. But I think it's not a huge jump of the imagination to imagine that for U-boat crews in the situation that they were in, it would have been particularly a pressing problem. And there's a couple of or a number of examples. So once you start looking for evidence of combat stress, you see it everywhere. So there's one successful commander who actually survived the war throughout, Heinrich Bleichroth. He essentially had a nervous breakdown in 1943 while on patrol, and had to be removed. His second in command took over, carried out the rest of the patrol. He was brought back and given a desk job, a shore job, to take him out of the front line. There are numerous other examples of people having panic attacks, of insomnia. There was one commander that routinely would dive to 50 meters, to essentially to have some space in which he could try and get some sleep because he had chronic insomnia. Again, it could have been something else, but there's a good chance that this was stress related. There are others who numerous examples of people essentially losing their minds temporarily during depth charge attacks. Wide-eyed, screaming, incapable, insensate. It's one of the sort of recurring themes of all of that first-hand material, is U-boatmen essentially losing their minds during these depth charge attacks and hedgehog attacks. There are a few salient examples. One most prominent one, I suppose, is the case of Peter Zech, who was the commander of U-505, who committed suicide during a depth charge attack in the October of 1943. So halfway through a depth charge attack, which could, in many cases, could last hours, he literally pulled out his pistol and shot himself in the head. And that is purely down to this, exactly this phenomenon of combat stress. So this idea of the fear, that heightened fear of their own demise, I suppose, and their own death, but also of the circumstances, the way in which it would happen. They knew very well that they were up against a very determined and deadly enemy. They knew that their chances of coming back from each patrol were diminishing every time they went out. So as I said, mid 43, statistical lifespan of between 2 and 3 patrols. By mid 44, that's down to just over 1 patrol. From then on, and they do carry on. The U-boat war doesn't stop in the spring of 1943. It sort of diffuses it almost across the whole globe, with the exception of the Pacific. But by the end, late 44 into 45, you're looking basically at something like a statistical lifespan of 1 patrol per crew. So they know that they're going out on essentially suicide missions at that point. And it's very telling that in the last 2 years of the war, for example, half of those U-boats that are sunk in that period are sunk on their maiden patrols. So this is tribute to that inexperience that I was mentioning before, and the real world effect that an experience amongst crews and commanders had. It meant that the vast majority of them were being killed on their maiden patrols. So that fear, that the PTSD is a big thing. It's one of the big themes, I think, that comes out of this, my research in this. So the third F, before I finish up, is futility. Now, what's the line that's often given whenever pretty much anybody actually talks about the U-boat war is the Churchill quote, which came from his memoir, his post-war memoir, where he said that the U-boat war, rather than the Battle of Britain or the Blitz or whatever it was, he said the U-boat war was the only campaign that really frightened him during World War II. He wrote that in 1947 when he wrote his memoir. And I think that line is a fairly short line, obviously, but I think that line has been taken and run with by a couple of generations of historians and various other commentators. You hear it, in documentaries all the time. It's one of the sort of standard lines of this narrative. I think that line has been run with by a couple of generations of historians and others, essentially, and has been exaggerated. It exaggerated the threat that the U-boat arm represented to Britain's existence. Just by way of clarity, the moment where, if you look back at Churchill's memoir, the moment where he actually writes that line, he's talking about the winter of 1940 to 41. And that was a particularly bad moment in Britain's war. So Britain at that point is still, in inverted commas, alone. So America hasn't entered the war yet. It is, a friendly, almost ally, but certainly a friendly force at that point. The Soviet Union has not yet been invaded, so that has not joined. The Grand Alliance has not been formed. So Britain tends to call itself alone in this time. Of course, it had the Empire. It had the largest naval merchant marine in the world at that point. So we should take that sort of self-diagnosis of being alone in 1940-41 with a degree with a pinch of salt, but it's nonetheless there's some truth in it. So that's a particularly frightening winter. And when Churchill says that, writes that, he's talking about the prospects from, looking forward from that winter. Essentially what he's saying was that if things carry on like they have been, this is going to get very, very serious for us. So the imports into Britain in January 1941, for example, were precisely half what they had been in January 1940. And that's largely due to the effect of the U-boat war in terms of hammering the British merchant fleet. So you can see where he's coming from with that quote. So he's foreseeing further cuts in rationing, for example, perhaps civilian unrest, that sort of thing, with the knock-on effect that it would have political consequences. So that's why he's talking about that in that way. But if you look at the figures, if you look at the statistics on this, it's pretty clear pretty quickly that Britain was never seriously under threat throughout the whole war. At that moment, that was the worst particular moment, I suppose, where the prospect of a severe threat was momentarily in view. But in general, I think you can see that the threat was not really there, or it's been hugely exaggerated. So to look at Allied, the strength of the Allied merchant fleet, for example, Britain goes to war with a merchant fleet largest in the world, as I've said, of 18 million tons. In 1939, the Allied merchant fleet at the end of the war, 1945, was 40 million tons. So it's more than doubled in that time. And that's largely due, of course, to the addition of the US and other allies coming in. Norwegians, for example, had a very big merchant fleet, and they lent a shoulder to the wheel already in 1940 and beyond. And of course, it's down to the additions via the Liberty Ships program that I mentioned before, which more than makes up for the losses that the Germans actually sank, which amounted to 15 million tons. So even with that 15 million tons included, the Allied merchant fleet is still 40 million tons by the end of the war, right? So it's pretty clear that, although you might have had dark days and dark moments and dark winters, it was pretty clear that, throughout the whole war, Britain was not really at threat. One killer statistic that I found was that 92% throughout the war, 39 to 45, 92% of cargoes by tonnage heading into Britain arrived unscathed. 92%. So this is not a country that is on the edge of disaster, thanks to the U-boat threat. When you look at German numbers as well, you can see that it just makes a nonsense of this idea of the U-boat as a significant threat. The Germans go to war in 1939 with 27 combat U-boats, 27. And bear in mind that, when you have a fleet like that, you can only really put a third of them into the field at any one time. So you're probably looking at less than 10 U-boats actually in theatre at any one time, because you've got a third of them are in port and a third of them are sort of, ferrying between the two. So less than 10 U-boats are actually in theatre in September 39. Dönitz always had this idea of having what he called the 300, the magic 300 fleet, which meant that he could have 100 U-boats in theatre at any one time. He only achieves that in July of 1942, so very late in the day, by which time, for all the reasons I mentioned before, the moment that he had, that strategic advantage that he had at the beginning of the war, has already gone, because Allied countermeasures are very much up to speed, and they are by that stage pretty much sinking German U-boats essentially for fun. So a couple of last statistics just to illustrate this, really, hammer this point home. Germany produced 859 combat U-boats during World War II. More than half of those, 465, failed to sink anything at all during the war, which kind of cuts against our usual assumption that these were tremendously effective and deadly killers. Of the 373 U-boats launched in and after 1943, so 43, 44, 45, 373 U-boats are produced and launched in that time. only 62 of those, i.e. 16%, 16%, actually succeeded in sinking anything at all. So that shows you really dramatically how in the second half of the war, the circumstances of the conflict really shift radically against the Germans. The poster boy for that failure, if you like, in that second half of the war, is U-427, which was a U-boat produced and launched in the summer of 1943, served right to the end to 1945. So it spent 2 full years in service in World War II. It sank precisely nothing. So it was amongst those, whatever it is, 84% that sank nothing. And it was depth charged over 600 times. So that's kind of the poster boy for that, that failing, the way in which the war shifted so radically against the German forces the second half of World War II. So that hopefully shows that, what they were trying, it's clear that what they were trying to achieve, they were trying to strangle Britain into submission by attacking those trade routes as effectively as they could. But really, if you look at the statistics on this and you get away from the propaganda and the hype, I think you can see that it was a pretty futile effort. They didn't have the numbers. The Allied fleets, particularly the British fleet initially, were simply too big to be strangled in the way that Dönitz and his U-boat crews tried to do. The last point, of course, is just to talk briefly about the cost of all of this. We've talked a lot about statistics and about the fate of the crews and so on, but just to mention the human cost of all of this, amongst the U-boat force, as I said, 859 combat U-boats sent in on patrol. Of those, over 400 were lost without trace. And this is what I was saying about the really effective Allied countermeasures, particularly the use of Hedgehog, which meant that they had no chance of getting back to the surface and saving some of the crew. They simply disappeared and were never seen again. 95% of wartime U-boat dead have no known grave. So they simply disappeared. And the official figure for the losses is 30,003 out of a total complement of just over 40,000. So 3 in 4 U-boatmen were killed during World War II. So 3/4, 75%, which is the highest rate of loss of any service in any army, I would say, in any war. Quite an astonishing figure. The average age of the dead, incidentally, is 22. And by the end of the war, you've got some commanders of U-boats who are only 23. They're astonishingly young, astonishingly inexperienced. On the Allied side, it's worth mentioning that there are 36,000 Allied merchant mariners killed during the war. So very similar figure to the German submariners loss, U-boatmen loss. And a similar figure, 35,000 of naval personnel, British, American, Canadian, and others. So in total, the Battle of the Atlantic and the wider U-boat war, costs upwards of 100,000 lives. And if you bear in mind the third of my F's, the futility, you have to wonder what it was all for. But there we are. That's a question for another day. I appreciate bombarded you for 40 minutes with lots of statistics and some ideas there. So hopefully there'll be a few questions to be thrown at me. I'm happy to try to answer them if I possibly can. So for the meantime, thank you very much for your attention.
No, thank you, Roger. That was wonderful. There are already a number of questions in the queue, and Mike, I see your raised hand. Let me take a few questions in the queue, and then Mike will go to you. And let me sneeze first.
Bless you.
The magic of allergies and recording on Zoom. Charles asked, what was the last date that the Germans sent U-boats into the Atlantic Ocean?
Well, that's a very good question. Generally, the horizons that they had kind of tended to shrink. So they go right across the Atlantic, really for the first time with Operation Drumbeat, which is in January 1942 after the American entry into the war. So they start raiding off the American East Coast at that point. They're still sending out U-boats in April and May of 1945, but they're not getting out necessarily into the Atlantic. I mean, some of them are already there, some of them are out in mid-Atlantic, but their horizons have shrunk so much by that point, that really their main hunting grounds at that stage in the war are around the waters around the British Isles and the western approaches. So their horizons have sort of shrunk accordingly. But that said, there are a couple of examples. You take, for example, U-977, which was in mid-Atlantic when it was ordered to surrender in early May 1945. And famously, it decided not to surrender. The crew decided not to surrender, decided instead to sail to Argentina. It was one of the two vessels that sailed to Argentina, arriving in August of that year. So that had been launched in late August from its base, and it was already in mid-Atlantic at that point. So they're still in mid-Atlantic, even in April, May 1945. Just in much smaller numbers and not operating as Wolfpacks. So the Wolfpack method had really been essentially abandoned by Dönitz already in the spring of 1943, because going toe to toe with the Allies, the losses were just too high and couldn't be sustained. So after that, the U-boats are still going out. They're going out to many seas across the world, but they're operating singly. They're operating as single raiders.
Mm. Brian asks, you note the casualty rate for the U-boats was extremely high, I think 70% or more. How did the Kriegsmarine command structure handle morale, given that many crews understood their odds of survival were worse than the Luftwaffe?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In the first instance, I think the Germans did very well initially with that generation of the aces that I mentioned, the likes of Otto Kretschmer and Gunter Prien and others. They built up such a mythology around the U-boat arm. It was seen as the elite, not only within the Kriegsmarine, but I think more generally within the German armed forces generally. It was seen as an elite. There were propaganda films made about them. Those successful commanders were brought back home. Very often they would be retired because if they lived long enough, they had a good chance of being retired and given a shore command or a training position, because it was too, the propaganda value or the propaganda damage rather of losing them was too great. So they would be retired to a shore position. So the sort of the status that they had and the esteem in which they were held, I think sustained the U-boat arm in that sense of its own morale to a large extent. And then of course you've got ideology, you've got their own patriotism, and you've got that element of well, we're all in this. It's they're all conscripted anyway, so it's not like they really have a choice. And in end effect, and I think you see this across all armies, across every conflict, they can have all of the best motivators possible, fighting for king and country or for the republic or for the constitution or whatever it might be, or for freedom. But ultimately men in extremis in war tend to fight for the bloke next to them. That seems to be universal, and that would apply to the German U-boat arm as well. So if you add into that, ideological, then also the power of the sort of kudos and the power and the mystique that Hitler had. And it's quite interesting after Hitler's death, there's a couple of examples of crews just kind of, and commanders who recorded their thoughts at that point, kind of saying, well, that's over now. Like, Hitler's gone, so why should we carry on? Because he was built up to such a status as a sort of a demigod, even for people that weren't necessarily political. They saw that was his status. So when Hitler was killed, well, he killed himself. Then in a sense the spell was broken. So the combination of all of that, I think, helps to explain why they carried on fighting.
Steve asks, was U-boat service voluntary as it was in the USN, and why did scurvy occur as just providing lemon juice, which could have been providing concentrated form, would have prevented it?
Yeah, the scurvy thing is interesting, and I've been asked that a lot. I know that they did take crates of oranges and limes and so on with them, and very often the men themselves, if they had access to that stuff, they would take their own little supply. But then again, you have to bear in mind, given the restrictions of rationing for the German state and for the German public, it was not always available. Those fruits come from elsewhere. They've got to come from Spain or wherever it is, or further than that. So those fruits were not always available to them. So there's certainly a shortage of them. And it's clear from the first-hand materials and the archival materials that scurvy was a problem. So, the evidence is there. So it's pretty clear that they didn't, it's a relatively simple fix, I agree, but they just didn't have the amounts that would enable them to do that. The first question, remind me, Greg, what was it?
Voluntary service, it wasn't voluntary for U-boats as it was for the US Navy.
Right. Yeah. So you've got conscription in general. So you've got conscription reintroduced in 1935 for German forces, and that included the German Navy. Now the U-boat arm was able to pick who it wanted out of each sort of batch of recruits into the taken into the Navy. So after your sort of basic training and so on, they would have, sometimes it was quite scientific, and the U-boat arm particularly wanted people with practical skills for the obvious reasons. So they wanted people with, who were electricians or plumbers or mechanics, that sort of thing, with practical skills. Not, you can take a peasant boy from East Prussia and give him a rifle and some basic training and put him in the infantry. You can't necessarily put him straight into a U-boat and expect him to function, terribly well anyway. So they wanted people who had particular skills. So that was sometimes part of the deal, that they would pull those people in, pull them across to the U-boat arm. But very often the selection procedure was just, if you're under 5'8", if you're relatively short, if you're relatively young, relatively fit, then you're in. So it could be as blunt as that. But as I said, it's a selection procedure from a batch of recruits that are already there and already conscripted.
How much of your research was available in English? That comes from Peter.
Um, a fair amount of it is available in English. So there's a few of the sort of memoirs and stuff that are quite well known that have been translated. The likes of Peter Kremer, for example, Herbert Werner. That they're quite well known volumes. But I kind of wanted to get beyond that. So the German material is kind of, I suppose, where the good stuff is. Not only archival, but then also unpublished stuff. There's a lot of unpublished stuff in German. And a lot of the archival reports, again, as I mentioned, of those doctors that were looking at PTSD, for example, the whole medical aspect. A lot of the stuff that talks about, the regime when they're on shore, a lot of that was available in German. Stuff about STDs as well. There's a lot of statistics around STDs, from crews that are ashore. A lot of that was in German. And then the Kriegstagebücher, the war diaries, only a few of those are actually available in translation. Most of them, a vast majority of them are only in the original. So it is a mixture. I would say, if I could just quantify it, I would say it's probably a third to two-thirds English to German. But so for doing this, I speak German. I used to live in Germany. So for doing this particular book, I really had to use my German, which was great. I enjoyed it a lot.
I'm just curious, Roger, where did you get access to the sailors' diaries, or is there an archive, or how do you get that material?
Yeah, there's an archive, a private archive, which is up in a place called Cuxhaven in northern Germany on the North Sea coast, which was set up by an ex-U-boatman himself, after the war. And he initially started it just to sort of, collect, essentially for his own benefit, to research his own crew and his own vessel and so on. And then it became a much bigger thing. And because there was no real official commemoration or official interest in the U-boat arm at that time, at least, now arguably still, he became a sort of focal point for other veterans and the children of veterans, who are basically saying, very often it would be a house clearance, and it'd say, "This is my dad's photo album," or whatever it would be, or it would be, the veterans themselves wanting to know what happened to the crews that they'd served with, and so on. So he became a focal point for all of that, and then gradually developed this huge archive, which is still available, or by appointment, but you can go and see it, and it's a fantastic resource.
Yeah,
Slightly chaotic, but it's nonetheless a fantastic resource.
yeah, sounds like it. A Zoom user asks, could you comment on British criticism of the U.S. Navy's delay in organizing convoys during the first month of Operation Drumbeat?
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting that there was a certain degree of, I think, rivalry, maybe I'd call it a friendly rivalry, between the British and the Americans at that point. Of course, the Americans have come into the war with Pearl Harbor, December 41. Um, I think there's a degree to which the Americans view themselves as sort of Romans to British Greeks in a way. You know, they see themselves as the inheritors of all of that stuff and slightly superior. They know a little bit better how to do things. Um, and in that opening phase of Operation Drumbeat, January 42, it's pretty obvious. You can see this from the German accounts that the Germans are encountering um, not even convoys, but isolated merchant vessels, you know, plowing up and down the American East Coast. The coastal towns are completely not blacked out. There's very little in the way of naval presence at all. So the U-boats, you know, you can literally be sort of cruising offshore and you can see in perfect silhouette the merchantmen, you know, silhouetted against the bright lights of the seashore, and they can pick them off as easy as anything. So they're making the comment that, you know, this is crazy. Like, why aren't they following the basic precautions that we're seeing and we have been seeing for the previous, you know, 2.5 years in the U-boat war? Um, so you can see that from the German perspective as well. They're astonished that this is not happening. And the British were actually saying at the time, again, I include some of this. My focus is much more on the German stuff, but I do include a couple of lines on this, that the British did, you know, advise the Americans that really they should start convoy procedures. They should institute a sort of blackout on the coastal settlements there on the East Coast. And the Americans essentially were very resistant. I suppose they didn't really want to, you know, essentially scare the horses. They didn't want to bring the war too close to home and start instituting a blackout. But they're very, very tardy in actually instituting sort of proper countermeasures against Operation Drumbeat. And so much so that the operation starts in January 1942. And I think the first U-boat that's actually sunk from memory is in April. So it takes them a good, you know, 3 or even 4 months to actually sink their first U-boat from that operation. And that tells you a story in itself.
Yeah. From Tom, you described Donnett's insistence on a mass boat strategy. What specific operational or industrial constraints prevented Germany from building the critical mass of U-boats that he demanded in 1939, 1940?
Yeah, good question. Of course, Germany has a pretty finite, you know, industrial capacity at that point. It's very good at building the stuff that it does build. It's got all of the tanks that it needed, arguably. They've built a pretty respectable surface fleet by that point. Dönitz had been arguing for his Magic 300 fleet really and since about 1936, and had been coming up, you know, butting up against the counter demands of, you know, every other branch of service and every other branch of the military industrial complex, if we use that phrase, in Nazi Germany, and he hadn't really come off very well. So, you know, he criticized Hitler, and I think with justification. He used to say that Hitler was continentally obsessed. I obsessed with the continent. So he didn't really have a you know, a vision of the naval war at all. He liked the big ships. He liked the Bismarcks and the Scharnhorsts and all the rest of it, because he saw them, I suppose, as baubles, as, like, you know, very visual representations of the restoration of German power, which is what, in a sense, you know, what the Third Reich's narrative of itself was. They saw themselves as the restoration of German power. So you know, the Bismarck, for example, you know, for the cost of a Bismarck, you could have built yourself 40 Type 7 U-boats.
Wow.
So the kind of the gist behind the question, yeah, you know, had they just dispensed with the surface fleet, which really didn't achieve anything at all, strategically speaking, throughout the war. Most of those vessels spent most of the war confined to port. Um, Bismarck, of course, you know, sunk mid-war in mid-Atlantic. So had you dispensed with that and instead built U-boats, you could have transformed it. You could have had, you know, Dönitz could have had his 300 fleet already in 1939, potentially. The problem is, of course, that the higher ups didn't see the potential of the tonnage war, of the U-boat war, in its strategic element. And Hitler only comes round to that realization in the autumn of 1941. So really too late. By that stage, you're sort of over the hump. The Grand Alliance is pretty much formed. I think it was November, so it's just before the Americans come in. But Hitler makes this grand statement where he says, we're going to start building U-boats. It's almost like I've finally seen the light. I've seen the light that Dönitz has been trying to persuade me of since 1936, but it's too late in 1941. So the short answer, yes, there's a finite capacity, and quite simply, the higher ups didn't see the strategic utility of the U-boat war, of the tonnage war, until it was already too late.
Roger, those boats you mentioned that Hitler finally caught religion on, were they Type 11 boats, or I'm just curious what particular ones they were?
With the beginning of the question, what was it, Greg?
Yeah, you said
Sorry?
Hitler finally decided he wanted to start building U-boats, but it was too late. I'm just curious what
Oh, I see.
type
No,
11.
those would have been mainly Type 7s.
Oh, okay.
So about 70% of the whole fleet were Type 7s, which is quite a primitive vessel. That's what they had at the beginning of the war. That it's really an updated version of the U-boat they had at the end of the First World War, the UB-3. It's not vastly different. So it's a submersible rather than a submarine. It spends 95% of this time on the surface, right? It's fairly primitive, crew of 50. So about 3/4 of the U-boat fleet is Type 7s. And then you've got Type 9s, which is a larger, it called it an Atlantic vessel, but it's slightly larger, better range, and better for going across the Atlantic, for example. But Type 7s did that as well.
And Type
And then
21.
the game changers are the 21s.
Yeah,
So
okay, sorry.
that's the potential game changer,
Yeah,
which they start playing around with oxygen-free propulsion,
yeah.
basically, crucially, right? And they start with the Type 17s, which don't really work, it's a prototype. In 1943, these are the so-called Walter boats. And then you've got the Type 21s, which is a sort of a weird offshoot from the Walter boats, which they've got already in 1944, but they just don't get them into combat. They've got over 100 Type 21s at the end of the war, but they can't get them into combat because they spring leaks all this. They've got so many
No,
teething troubles,
no.
and it's all to do with their the strange way in which they're constructed.
Hmm.
And it's fairly cutting edge technology. It was, that's the first proper submarine, arguably, right?
Yeah,
So
just
potentially it would have been a game changer, but in reality, they just never got the thing to run.
that's interesting. On that comment of game changer, Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, Mike. Yes,
Great. I have to say, excellent talk. You really packed quite a bit
I
in a
did. Thank you.
nicely. No, very, very, very well done.
Yeah, Roger, you should do this full time, I think, is what Mike. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll consider that.
Well, with time off for good behavior. But, and I would say that as far as the problem with the Americans, it could go back to Churchill's line, which is that Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other
Every
possibility.
other option. Yeah.
But and I also would posit it seems to me I'm trying to get this down to two questions, but the fact of it seems to me that the starvation issue, the starvation of the British Isles would not have been as much of an issue as the second front, getting military equipment and personnel
Yeah,
over.
that too. Yeah.
And that might have been the threat he was referring to. But the questions are, the first one is, to what extent did the Allied bombing campaign, which picked up with the Americans' daylight precision bombing campaign and the round-the-clock bombing, to what effect did that have, not just on the bombing of the U-boat pens, but on the U-boat factories or torpedo factories,
Mhm.
etc.? What effect did that have on the U-boat war starting in, let's say, late 42, early 43?
Yeah.
And the second question, which is pertinent to the main points of your talk, was all of the disease, all
Yeah.
of the PTSD, the disease, the health problems. I won't even get into bathroom facilities because people are eating after
Let's
this.
not. Yeah.
That's right. But to what extent did that have an effect on the combat effectiveness of the U-boat crews, particularly at the end of towards the end of a patrol, when it got worse and worse?
Mm.
Those are
Yeah,
two
good,
separate.
good, three good questions. I just scribbled down a little note there. IG,
I
yeah.
wouldn't mind you if you need to.
So that first point that you made, Mike, about the, I suppose the sort of the aspect, whichever dominant aspect it was, whether it's, you know, men and material for the second front, or whether it's, you know, what it is that sort of scared Churchill. I think if you look at the timing when he's referring to in that comment, as I said, he's making that comment or referring to the winter of 1940-41, and at that stage it's much more about, essentially about survival, without putting it, you know, making it too dramatic, but it's about Britain's survival rather than the prospects of any future second front. Because bear in mind, of course, the Americans are not yet in formally. Of course, the Americans are a friendly power in that sense. They're already assisting with some sort of with escort duties and so on. You've got the you know, the arsenal of democracy is already happening. So, you know, they're there on the fringes, but they're not yet a competent nation. So I think it's much more, in Churchill's mind, it's about survival rather than the potential prospects for a second front. I mean, that kicks in obviously later on. You know, 42, he starts thinking about in those terms. I don't think he's thinking about that in 40, with that winter of 40-41. In terms of your second question about the bombing, or your first question rather, that was more of a comment about the bombing. So yeah, there's a really thoroughgoing targeting once the air war really gets going. So 42 and into 43, there's a really thoroughgoing targeting, you know, first of the Biscay ports, of the ports, the French ports where the U-boat crews are operating from, places like Lorient. I mean, Lorient as a town, I don't know if anyone has actually been there. It's pretty unlovely. It was nice once, but it's a pretty unlovely town now. And it was basically destroyed by essentially British, but also American bombing. Um, but crucially, and you could say the same thing about a lot of the other port towns as well. Some of them are lovelier now than Lorient, or somewhere like Saint Malo is rather lovely, but you know, still bombed pretty heavily during the war. But Lorient was basically wiped out because that was the headquarters of the U-boat arm. Was basically wiped out, and they didn't really damage the U-boat pens at all. So they damaged the sort of the infrastructure, you know, the sort of the hotels where the men were billeted or the officers were billeted, you know, the gymnasiums that were converted into barracks for the men, or the bars that they used to go to when they're on their downtime. All those places got destroyed, but the U-boat pens were not, because they had sort of 9 meter you know, reinforced concrete roofs, so they were pretty much immune to Allied bombing. So for, you know, there is a sort of knock-on effect. There's a disruptive effect to the U-boat strategic effort from that bombing, but it's not decisive in the early phase of the war. Later on, it becomes decisive once they start really late as well. It's sort of late 44 and into 45. Where they start bombing, you know, places like Wilhelmshaven, Blumenvoss in Hamburg, you know, the Schichau works in Danzig, and then of course the Valentin works, which is near Bremen, which is the famous place where they were you know, trying to build Type 21s at the end of the war. You know, that was hit about 2 weeks before the place was supposed to be operational. So it basically never became operational. The Germans, it was hit, I think, in February, March 1945, I think it was. It's very late. But the British and Americans basically waited for it to be very close to operational and then hit it as hard as they could. So they're watching all of this. And so that, you know, the premise of your question is, you know, how far were they able to disrupt that through aerial bombing? And the short answer is, in a decisive way, only really quite late on, late 44 into 45. There is a lot of bombing earlier on, like I said, particularly the Biscay ports and so on, but it tends to destroy the town, but it doesn't necessarily destroy the U-boat pens themselves and the U-boat installations, because they're so well built and so well protected. So it's a slightly more nuanced picture, I would say. Your second question about the hygiene and its sort of relationship to combat. That's a very good one, actually. And I'm just sort of thinking about that as I try and answer it. I haven't really seen, I think it's fair to assume, again, the premise of your question, I think it's fair to assume that, as conditions deteriorated for the men, and they had this sort of, like you can imagine someone with, rampant red dog infection and sort of, scabies and, boils in their armpits and all that sort of thing, and they stink and they're in their own filth for 6 weeks. I mean, I'm not exactly selling it, I know. But you can imagine how you put someone in that environment and then you say, right, now go and fight. They're going to go, oh, for God's sake, really? But this is the same. They used to say about the Red Army on the Eastern Front, you could smell them before you saw them, right? Because they were so filthy. They smelt of horse dung and cigarettes, basically. That was supposedly was the smell. So to some extent, there's a lot of, 'twas ever thus, this is how armies fight. They're all, like you think of the battle. I was doing a thing recently on Korea. You think of the Battle of Imjin River in 1951, and they're sitting in foxholes, in freezing water, fighting off hand-to-hand combat against the Chinese. They're not thinking that they've got trench foot and that they're freezing cold when at that moment of combat, right? So at some point, everything takes over. I think it's a fair assumption that the rest of us, if we were sent out in a U-boat for 6 weeks or 8 weeks in our own filth, and we've got red dog and scabies, and on the way home we'd be going, well, thank God this is coming to an end. I think for those, yeah, they would certainly have shared that thought, but then when it came to combat, they just knuckled on and did it because the alternative is that you get killed. So I think they, in terms of that having a knock-on effect on their sort of combat performance, I think probably minimal. Although we might assume that would be different, I think in reality it probably wouldn't be.
Right. Well, thank you. Great answers. Thank you very much for everything.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Roger. That concludes our talk today. Again, the book is Wolfpack, Inside Hitler's U-Boat War by Roger Moorhouse. Obviously, great book. Please pick it up. Link in the chat. Please join us next Saturday, November 29th at 1 p.m. when historian Rudy Tomiti will discuss his latest book, Saving MacArthur, the story of America's most daring naval rescue and of the men it left behind, which discusses the fates of the 71 PT boat crewmen left behind to suffer capture and death or fight a guerrilla war against the Japanese. I know MacArthur's always a lightning rod, so I look forward to next week's Q&A. Hopefully you can join us. Again, thank you to our speaker and the audience for joining us this afternoon. Please have a happy Thanksgiving for those on the this side of the Atlantic, and we hope to see you next week. Thanks again, Roger. That really was a wonderful talk.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Greg. All the best.
Yeah, likewise.